It's California Edition. My name is Brad Pomerance. We are joined by Amanda Hollis-Brusky. She is a professor at Pomona College. She has a book coming out. It's called Ideas with Consequences, the Federalist Society and the Conservative Counter-Revolution, focused on the Supreme Court and the courts in general. Let's talk about the Supreme Court and then go down to the lower courts. Sure. It's interesting because over the last, couple decades, we've had more Democratic presidents than Republican presidents in terms of coverage, and yet the Supreme Court still feels pretty conservative. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, right now what I like to say is the Supreme Court is as about ideologically polarized as it's ever been. What I mean by that...
Even from the FDR era?
Just about as sort of polarized as the FDR court in the 1930s. We have 4 justices on the court that consistently vote conservative, all Republican appointees.
Right.
4 justices on the court who consistently vote liberal, all Democratic appointees, and 1 swing justice,
right,
Anthony Kennedy.
Who is a Republican and was considered quite a conservative in the 90s, but I don't know if he's become less conservative or if our views of conservatism have changed.
I would say it's issue focused, right? So on many issues that matter to conservatives and libertarians, he's in their camp. Federalism, states' rights, limits to the federal commerce power. But on issues such as gay rights and abortion, he's certainly been a champion and has voted with the liberal bloc in those cases.
And let's talk about Anthony Kennedy and his contemporaries, because there are 3 other justices on the court that are his age, or around his age. 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, Antonin Scalia being a Republican, and then the Democrats would be Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Stephen Breyer. Right. And, people live longer now, but, at some point, someone's going to resign or pass away. What does that say to you about the future of the court?
Yeah, so one of the things to remember is that, the Supreme Court sort of follows the election returns. And what that means is we elect a president who then has the power to appoint judges and justices that align with his or her values. Right. And recently, those judges and justices have been staying on the court for a very long time.
Right.
Between 1789 and 1970, Supreme Court justice served an average of 15 years. Many served only 8, like a 2-term president.
Right.
And now that's jumped up to over 25 years.
Wow. With
most justices serving into their 30s and some into their 40s.
Right.
So the implications for these next 2 election cycles are pretty important for the Supreme Court. 4 justices, as you said, over the age of 70. Right. 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans. So who controls the White House in 2016, 2020 is going to be decisive in terms of where this court goes.
And what's interesting about the whole nomination question is that, as I'm sure you may remember, a couple of years ago, the Democratic majority in the Senate really altered the nuclear option, the filibuster, so that there are no filibusters permitted for appellate court and district court nominees, but still for Supreme Court nominees. So regardless of who's in the majority in the Senate, unless they hit 60, which I don't see that happening for either party anytime soon, those nominations can be very contentious.
They are very contentious, and they've become increasingly so since the 1970s, 1980s, in part because the stakes are so high. Because we see these lower federal court judges and Supreme Court justices serving longer and longer. Presidents know they get 1 crack at this.
And what seems like we are facing throughout the end of this decade, and look, anything could happen in 2016, but, early betting would suggest that Hillary Clinton is a front runner. I'm not taking a position, but is a front runner. And, if you had to bet today, probably the next president. And you also could argue that the Republicans probably become, stronger in the Congress, both Senate and House, Senate being the most important. So where do we go with that? I mean, how do you look at the Supreme Court when you have divided government likely into the next decade?
Yeah, I mean, the stakes are really high. I think you're going to see a lot of contentious battles over lower federal court judges, over Supreme Court nominees. And because there's some issues that have come before the court in the last 6 or 7 years that have been decided by 1 vote.
Right, and that being
5-4.
Mostly Anthony Kennedy.
Mostly Anthony Kennedy. And really issues that affect all Americans: campaign finance, Voting Rights Act, gun rights. These are issues that...
Affordable Care Act.
The Affordable Care Act.
Right, I mean, who thought John Roberts...
Challenges continue.
As they do.
Right, challenges continue.
I want to talk about one issue, though, that, as you know, I used to be a full-time practicing lawyer. I clerked for a federal judge, so a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. So I like to follow the court. I was stunned that the court did not take the marriage equality cases, because there there's a split in the circuits, no?
Not yet.
Oh, I guess technically there is not a split in the circuits. That's the issue. All circuits have upheld marriage equality, but still I would have thought they would have taken the case.
And it's not unprecedented for the Supreme Court to take a case, even when there is agreement in the circuits.
Right.
Especially, this is the civil rights issue of our generation.
It is.
And it's highly...
Virginia versus Loving. You
It
like
is
that? I
Loving
knew
v.
that?
Virginia,
Which is the
actually,
interracial.
1967.
Right.
There you
that
go.
was the law that overturned bans on interracial marriage.
Yeah, and so when we think about marriage equality, and we know, well, we suspect at least, that there are 5 votes on the Supreme Court right now to sort of articulate a broad
Uphold.
right.
So you do
Marriage
believe
equality.
that Anthony Kennedy is because he did on the DOMA case.
Defense of marriage case,
Right.
he did. And what I suspect is that the Supreme Court is trying to move incrementally on this. They're going to let it sort of work its way
Right.
through the circuits. As of right now, the practical effect of them not ruling
Right.
means all of those circuit court rulings striking down bans on marriage equality go into effect.
But what seems to me is that the reason why these circuits, even some of the most conservative circuits, are ruling in favor of marriage equality is because they look at that DOMA case and it just seems to them that, they need to follow precedent. And so, I mean, in a way, isn't it kind of a fait accompli because of the Defense of Marriage Act case?
Yeah, and this is where Justice Scalia's dissent in that case is pretty prophetic, because he said,
Tell us.
Now it's inevitable. The way you've articulated the rationale for this ruling makes marriage equality in every state inevitable. And of course, he's arguing in dissent,
Right.
but in some ways he's very prophetic.
But what's interesting about the Scalia camp is that one could argue that they're about states' rights. And so couldn't one say it's a conservative position to allow states to decide on marriage equality?
Yeah, and so what mmany states after 2008 banned same-sex
Right.
marriage. And so that states' rights argument plays in his favor.
Yeah, right, so it
but
goes
what
both
you
ways.
see is,
Right.
you see these justices retreat from the states' rights camp when it doesn't necessarily
Right.
align with their political preferences.
Let's talk about the lower courts, the
Sure.
appellate courts. We've been discussing it, as well as the district courts, where I clerked in
Yeah.
Colorado, for example. Give us a sense of what's happened with those courts in terms of appointees.
Yeah, so like I said, the Supreme Court, but also the lower federal courts follow the election returns. So between Nixon forward, we had 28 years of Republicans in the
right.
White House and only 18
Right.
Democrats. So from about 1988 until 2012, the lower federal courts were leaning Republican.
Right.
They were mostly Republican appointees.
Sure.
And it's only been in the last 4 years that that's started to tip. And now the Democrats, there's a slight advantage for Democrats in the lower federal courts. And that's important because, remember, the Supreme Court only takes 1% of the cases that are appealed to it every year. So most of these decisions are being hashed out in these lower federal courts. And these lower federal courts, these judges can serve 40 years, and they're serving
easily.
longer and longer. Right in our own backyard in the Ninth Circuit, John Clifford Wallace, he was appointed in 1970 by President Nixon.
Right.
And he is still on the Ninth Circuit Court
Not
of Appeals.
senior status. Do you know?
Just in the last 5 years, I think.
But they still,
But he had
they
been
still hear
active.
cases.
Actually, I think he had a mimeograph machine in his office when
I
they
love
started.
that. There's one issue that does seem to be percolating in California, and that deals with campaign finance reform. California seems to be very vocal, at least its elected officials, against Citizens United,
Yeah.
which kind of opened the floodgates for spending, looking towards increasing disclosure in terms of donors to campaigns. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, disclosure is extremely important to California, given how much we rely on the ballot initiative.
Right.
I think I was reading in 2012 alone, opponents and supporters of ballot initiatives spent somewhere around $477 million.
Wow. Wow.
That's nearly half of what was spent across the entire country that year on ballot initiatives.
Right.
And the only reason we know where that money is coming from are because of these disclosure laws that require individuals and businesses to disclose their financial
And
contributions.
one could argue in our final moments that the Supreme Court would be protective of anonymity, whereas California is trying to take the veil off of anonymity.
Yeah, and what the Supreme Court has said, they've upheld disclosure laws up to this point, but these the lower federal courts, there's a group of lawyers, the same group that bought us
Right.
Citizens United,
Right.
who are saying this is a First Amendment issue, right? It's about
Fascinating.
political speech.
Will you come back?
I'd love to.
That would be great. Her name is Amanda Hollis-Brusky. She is a professor at Pomona College. My name is Brad Pomerance, and this is California Edition.